Good morning. This thing always waits just a little bit, and I'm always like, okay, is this going to do it or not? Right? But I'm live. I hope you are too. That's a good sign if we're both live here, right, together. Absolutely. Well, I hope you had a good weekend. I hope we had a good first of the year. I hope you had a good last of the last year. It's been pretty interesting around here, that's for sure. That's all I'm going to say about that. But it's all good. So, this is our first peace out video for this year. First one for 2023. And see, my computer even says 2023 now, so that's perfect, right? Absolutely perfect. Anyway, so I'm not big into a lot of traditions, but I'll make my first journal entry. I started reading the Bible through yesterday, so I don't know, I'm 10 chapters in or so. I try to use those little Bible reading things, but the stories get so good and I get so involved, I can't cut off. Like they want me to read the one I have in the back of my little, I don't even know, is that CEV? Is that what it is? So it's a new version. I was trying to just kind of read it. It wants me to read like Matthew 5. And I'm like, you realize the Sermon on the Mount is Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I can't just read Matthew 5. You've got to read the whole Sermon on the Mount. You don't just read chapter 5 when the Sermon on the Mount is all three chapters. So I can't really follow those. So I'll just be ahead of it for a while. I'll make up if I miss a day here and there. And I'm already to chapter 10 of Genesis because that's where the nations are listed there as the nations began to develop. And so it's after the flood. See, I had to read all of the creation, and then I had to read all of Noah, and then I'll read the next section. Right? We're going to start with Abraham tomorrow when I get up. So I can't just stop in the middle of something. It has to have a good place to stop. That's just one of those oddities that you love about me, right? Anyway, and it is annoying, but it's just that way. Anyway, so as I was reading, I thought there was something in this morning's reading, but I got a different Bible because the other one is CEV and it's like this big, so I'm reading without any glasses, so I didn't even bring it in here. So I was looking in the my new living because I thought it had another way of saying what I had read yesterday, but I didn't see it. So I'll just go back to this one because I marked this one because there's something significant, or I was always taught this. It may not be all that significant, okay? But I was always taught that the first mention of something in scripture is just like significant because it's the first time it's ever mentioned anywhere about anything ever happening anywhere, right? So creation, of course, the first mention is in the first chapter, but it was significant, right? We wouldn't be here without the first chapter, right? And so the first mention of worship, when I went on a kind of a binge, I guess you could say, a few decades back now, and I was studying worship. And worship, I love teaching on worship, by the way, but worship is first mentioned in the King James and most versions in Genesis 22, where Abraham took Isaac up, and he says, we're going to go worship and I'll be back. And that was the first mention of worship, but in some of the newer translations, worship is mentioned earlier, including the verse I'm going to read here in a minute, in a second. In Genesis 4, it was Genesis 4 gives us the rundown of Cain and Abel, and then how Abel has died, and Cain killed Abel, and then Adam and Eve went and had more children. Excuse me, and it talks about, well, Cain's kids and all that, and then he had Seth. They had Seth, and it says, when Seth grew up, and I don't know what verse I'm in, 25, 26. When Seth grew up, so we're talking years. We read that little phrase and go, and Seth grew up, but we're talking, what was that to them? 30 years, 40 years? He grew up though. It's not, we read, sometimes that's one of the problems with reading scriptures is we kind of miss that time element. There was a lot of time between Adam slept with his wife again, and they gave birth to another son. She named him Seth, for she said, God has granted me another son in place of Abel, the one Cain killed, when Seth grew up. We read that and we just kind of glance over it, but this was years from verse 25 to verse 26. It was years. Seth grew up, right? When Seth grew up, he had a son and named him Enosh. It was during his lifetime, Enosh, not Enoch yet, Enosh, during his lifetime that people first began to worship the Lord. And King James says first began to call on the name of the Lord. Is how the King James and New American Standard and most of the others, but this and the New Living translated it as worship. And I was like, okay, we're 4 chapters in. We've had Adam and Eve. They've fallen out of the garden, but we've had a sacrifice. We had Cain and Abel brought sacrifices to God. Were they not worshiping? Were all these things not worship? Were all these other acts in these first four chapters not worshiping? It's all of a sudden now. It's like just now, after when as Seth has grown, now his son, which would be uh, Adam and Eve's grandson, it says during his lifetime, people began to worship the Lord. And so I was like, it was the first time people were worshiping God. And I wondered what that was like as I sat and thought about that. Because sometimes when something kind of stands out to me, I told, I've told you this plenty of times that I'll read till something grabs me and then I stop there for a little bit and I just let my mind camp there. What does that really mean? What does that look like? Well, I look back at the rest of the other four chapters, and this wasn't worship, this wasn't worship, this is now they're just now starting to go, hey God, we want to worship you. What were Adam and Eve doing? Were they mad at God? Were they not? Did they not continue a close relationship with him after they got kicked out of the garden? And she acknowledges him because she says, God has granted me another son, right? And so there was some joy there, and kind of thankfulness towards God for letting her have more children, you know, after Cain and Abel incident, right? And so, but I'm like, were they not worshipers? Were they not thinking about God more? It just makes you wonder what was going on. There's not that many people on the earth. There's probably plenty of animals on the earth. The wildy beasties were out there, right? And so, but I was thinking about that, and I thought, I wonder, do you remember? This is a question that came up in my mind as I was thinking about some of these things this morning. Do you remember the first time you ever called on God? Do you remember your first prayer you ever prayed? Were you a child? Were you an adult? Have you not even done it yet? You never know, right? Do you remember the first time? And I wonder what it was like for God when in the scripture we have this side of it. People began to worship God on the earth. And it's like, yeah, but then we're gonna go right into the story of Noah where they're gonna all lose it, and it says their minds only wanted to do evil, and it looks so much like what we see today. People are bent on being deceived and deceiving others and being hateful and mean and weird. We live in a strange time, right? But but it says they started calling on God. They started worshiping God, and I thought, when you have a child, uh, and they finally get old enough and they finally say, "Mom," and they know you. They realize you're mama, because when they're a baby, they go, mama, dad, dad, and they're just learning to make sound and they don't really know. But once they make that connection and they're like, mama, and, or mom or mommy or whatever they call, there's that does something to your heart, right? Or they say daddy for the first time or dada, and they know it's dada, they know dada and mama, and they know that they know who you are. That's a special moment, special bonding moment between a child and their parents when they've been nurturing them for all these months, or maybe a year, even however old kids actually start trying to know that these days, right? And all of a sudden there's a connection between that parent, a new connection. It's like, oh, it makes your heart kind of flutter, like, oh, my baby knows who I am. That's my baby. And they know I'm their mom. It's kind of the same too when you're called into any kind of position in leadership in the church. The first time you take a pastorate and somebody calls you pastor, and needs you in that role, begin to realize you're a pastor, begin to realize you're a song leader, begin to realize you're a psalmist or a prophetess or an apostle or a teacher, and they recognize that, and it does something to you. So I wondered what God's side was to this. Did he go, yeah, about time, right? But it must have been it was significant enough that Moses wrote it down as God was kind of giving it to him, right? As he was trying to write down all these they had historians back there that tried to write all the stories down because that was the only way they were going to remember it. But they told it to their children and their grandchildren. They told them and they remembered things, right? They didn't have it all stored on a phone. And so I wonder, back to my question, when was the first time you called on God? Do you remember the first time you prayed? I do. I do. I was scared. I was so scared. Mama had left me but with my baby brother Dean. He was a baby. So I was only 8 years old and it had started raining and that's why she left me there with him. He was asleep in the baby bed in the back of the house. I was only 8, y'all. We don't do that these days. But it started raining and I didn't know what happened then, but later I found out because the water had run under the house, and we had a floor furnace, and it was this flame was, it wasn't coming out of it, but it was the, I noticed the flame got, I don't even know why I noticed, but I noticed the flame got really big in the floor furnace. So I grabbed Dean out of his baby bed and I went to the living room, which was further away from the furnace because the he was in mom and daddy's bedroom, which was back on the other side of the, down a big long hall, and their room was on the end of that hall. And so I went and got him and brought him to the other side of the house where we were safer. I thought that at 8, imagine that. I was a pretty bright kid. Anyway, and I laid him on the couch, and I knelt down in front of the couch and I prayed and I said, God, I don't know what to do. I'm scared. Please tell me what to do. And immediately I knew to call daddy at work. Now, I don't know if my parents had ever told me that. I don't know if it was, I don't remember them telling me. I just know at that moment I knew to call daddy, and I called daddy at work. I had to get the phone book out and use the phone book at 8 years old, found where he worked and called him at work. And he called the neighbor who came over, and who actually, Marshall Glenn, worked on floor furnaces, and he was a plumber and stuff like that. So then Marshall Glenn came in and talked to me and said, it's okay, it just got wet and all that. But that's the first time, other than getting saved at 6, that's the first time I knew that I called on God and he answered. And that's a special moment in my life. So do you have a I just want you to spark your memory there. Do you remember the first time you ever prayed, even if you didn't get an answer? Was it during the pandemic? For many people, that was, many people started praying then. I wish we would still continue, right? And that's where that relationship starts, and that completes kind of a circuit. Because here God is, He's made Adam and Eve. They already messed up. They got kicked out of the garden. They've made babies, and the babies have making babies. And all of a sudden, one of them goes, "Hey, God," and God must go, "Yeah, it's about time," right? And it must have, it kind of completed a circuit. Will you let him complete that circuit in you today? Because this is still the same today. When we speak, he listens. We know he hears us, right? And we have Hagar, where she even said, God hears, God sees. God sees us and he hears us, but it all of a sudden it's doing something to him, and to God rather than just the people. And it completes that circuit when we look back at God and go, hey, you are my creator. You did decide to put me right here, right now. You did decide to give me life and to sustain me to this day. And that completes kind of this circuit is the best way I can describe it. Like an electrical power, right? And all of a sudden you can reach the throne of God when you need him. You can anyway, but all of a sudden you know it. That baby could reach for the mama anytime. When they first start crying, they just want somebody to feed them, and they don't care who it is. When they start getting a little bit older, they just want their mama, or they want a bigger brother or sister, or they want their daddy, or they want the grandma. Then they get picky at who they want. Are you picky who you want to be active in your life? We want God to be active in our life. So I'm just encouraging you on this first day of the year, the first day of our devotions, second day of the year, technically, uh, you know, to just take a moment and complete that circuit and just talk to God today. Whether you do it every day, or whether you haven't done it in days, or you haven't done it in years, or you haven't ever done it, just complete that circuit and just talk to God today, and just ask him to bless your year. Ask him to direct your footsteps. Pray a scripture if you know a scripture. Just talk to God today. He will love to hear from you, and I promise he'll answer. He really will. And I just want to focus on worshiping God today. And I'm not going to teach on worship, but I might Thursday night. You never know. You have to stay tuned, right? And so I just encourage you to go back to this Prince of Peace, this God who gives us peace, this God of hope, and talk to him today about whatever situation you're dealing with, or whatever good's going on in your life. There's not a list. He doesn't say, "Oh, that's not a list. You can't talk to me about that today." No, that's all the Wednesday list. Come back Wednesday for that. What's that one? No, you can't. No, that's a Friday. No, oh, you can't ever ask me about that one. No, no, he doesn't have a list that excludes the things you can talk to him about. So take time today and just talk to God like he's sitting there. Why? Because he is. Have a great day. Peace out. Remember that the God of peace is with you. Have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow.